front or wherever, or stand. Make yourself home.
Oh, I guess I'm first.
But don't worry, Holly, just hang there. I've got to tell everybody how clever you are first.
Oh dear.
As we try and get this YouTube streaming going.
Everyone expects to stay at home and watch it on the internet. Now, these days.
What are we waiting for?
We're waiting for the live stream to start.
Oh.
So technical.
Where is
Amazing.
that? Where is the live stream camera?
Yeah.
Right
In
there.
that laptop.
How about
It will
that?
capture your best angle, I've checked.
Oh boy.
I'm standing in front of it right now.
Is it, will the picture be as jumpy as the...
No, we've perfected that.
Yeah? What was the issue last time?
It was on 30 frames per second, not 60.
30, it was on about 1 frame a second. The version I saw.
Is it via the Prosper website or?
That's an excellent question. I think
No,
it's
we
usually-
haven't quite got that. We need to get one more tick from Google to be able to do that. But it looks like we are live. 3, 2, 1.
Wonderful.
3, 2, wonderful.
Well, welcome everybody to Prosper Australia. My name's Emily. I'm one of the members of staff here, along with Carl. It's lovely to see a few friendly faces and some new faces. We're here tonight to launch the new PARI, Prosper Australia Research Institute report, authored by Dr. Gavin Putland, Trickle Up Economics, assessing the impact of privatised land rent on economic growth. But why are we really here? I was thinking about this morning as I was walking to the train, and I ran into one of the young women who collects for the charities outside the train station. And her line to me was, would you like to save a child's life today? And I made a joke along the lines of, I have already saved a child's life today because my son was in a foul mood and I didn't kill him. And then kept going to my bus. But of course the answer to that question is yes. Yes, I want to save a child's life today. I want to save a child's life every day. WaterAid is a charity, the charity that stopped me, is one of the charities that attempts to deliver clean drinking water to people who are unable to simply turn on the tap and watch their children drink clean, safe water from the comfort of their kitchen, which is a privilege that I enjoy. So what we're really talking about here today is inequality, wealth inequality. It's what we're always talking about here at Prosper. The persistent inequality of wealth between people, between places. We believe it to be immoral and unnecessary. And it's the desire to understand and to ameliorate inequality that has driven many of us to study economics, driven many of us to work or volunteer or become involved with Prosper Australia. Because the classical economists identified that privatisation of land rent was a key mechanism in generating wealth inequality. And, you know, Polly and Gavin are going to talk at length about these concepts. Land rent, economic rent, all taxes coming out of rent, how tax reform fits into this equation, how we can have a more equal society and a more vibrant economy when we focus on the structural issues that generate the kinds of distributions of wealth that we see today in the world. This particular report reveals how Australia's land boom has led to significant changes in our own country about who gets what. So we are very, very lucky to have here tonight Dr. Polly Cleveland, who is an adjunct professor of economics at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs in New York City. Polly is an economist and a long-time activist for social justice. She's also the executive director of the Association for Georgia Studies. She has a background in physics and mathematics, and she received her PhD in agricultural and resource economics from the University of California in 1984. Her dissertation was entitled "The Consequences and Causes of Unequal Distribution of Wealth," and it addressed George's basic questions in a modern model, showing how unequal distribution of wealth lowers economic productivity and growth, which is very similar to what we'll be talking about here tonight. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Polly Cleveland.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to your beautiful country. I lived in Sydney as a child, so this has been a wonderful opportunity to return to a place where I lived very happily for 3 years, but it's my first time in Melbourne, and it's my first time seeing wild kangaroos hopping around at this wonderful place where I stayed with Carl and his family. So, okay, trickle up policy, how rent bias damages the economy. And this is sort of an introduction to Gavin, that's how you pronounce it?
Gavin.
Gavin or Gavin?
Gavin.
Gavin, okay. Report that he has just produced. So this is just a little bit of background theory on how rent bias damages the economy. And this is Trickle Up Economics is for us, and I was once one of the billionaires for Bush, and that's me and my husband marching to the Republican convention in New York City in 2004, and we had a little fife and drum behind us as we marched in our evening gowns and tuxedos. So anyway, billionaires for Bush are all in favor of trickle up economics. Okay, this is one of Gavin's graphs showing Australian land rent as a percent of GDP, and obviously land rents are increasing over time, as are taxes, which leaves a kind of a squeeze of oh, okay, how does it?
The red one.
Red one, okay, which leaves a squeeze on wages and return to capital. And that is troubling for good reason. And this is another one of Gavin's curves showing again how if you add taxes to rents, and that's because taxes are taken from rents and are representative of rents, you can see that labor and capital is getting squeezed by the increase in rents. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the background in economics to show why we can sort of assume that when we post those taxes, we can add them to rents to get the total amount of rent being taken out of the income stream, that is, which GDP is roughly the national income stream. I mean, very roughly. A lot of things get left out, but best we can do for the moment. Okay?
Excuse me, apologies.
And so we have two principles which go back to the French physiocrats, at the very least, that is in the 1700s, who influenced Adam Smith. All taxes come out of rent. And the principle is called at-core. At-core means the tax share includes rent. So to get the land share, you add the tax to the estimated rent. And that's because you can't tax a wage beyond what people are willing to accept. If you try and tax a wage more than what people are willing to accept, they'll go away, they won't work, they'll go somewhere else. Ditto for production. You can only get taxes out of a surplus beyond what people are willing to produce. So that's the meaning of at-core, and it may seem a little bit strange, but I'll go through a little bit of the mechanics. Ebb-core, excess burden, what a horrible term. Excess burden is the amount of production, wages, and general economic activity that is destroyed by bad taxes or other bad policies and practices. So it's stuff that didn't happen. So it reduces the blue. If we go page up, where is page up? Page up. That blue gets reduced by EBCOR. That is, there's just excess burden cuts out some of the production productivity that you could have. So EBCOR is an absence of production. And EBCOR obviously reduces capital and labor, so it reduces the capital and labor share. And I had to learn to spell labor, L-A-B-O-U-R again. The computer kept reminding me. Okay. So all taxes come out of rent. Now I'm just going to give you one slide from a project I did, which is just showing you a little bit of what's going on in the US, which is the same as is going on here. Something has gone wrong. And all of a sudden how does this thing go? It's not doing anything.
Red one.
Red one, okay. After years of average compensation, wages matching growth in productivity, sometime around the beginning of the 1980s, productivity took off or continued to rise while wages stagnated. That's happened in the US. I'm sure it's happened here too, but that's not in this report. And what happened around 1980 was, of course, the election of Ronald Reagan and a whole switch in policies on both taxes and on monopoly. That is, taxes. They cut the income tax, the upper rates, and they stopped clamping down on monopoly. So this is what's happening in the US, but again, you see graphs doing funny things. Page down is somewhere. Wait a moment, enter. Okay. So I'm going to go back to a little bit of the basics of supply and demand. Some of you, I hope, have heard of Alfred Marshall, you know, the great English economist, and he was sort of at the transition. He had kind of a tussle with George, but he still believed in land, labor, and capital, and he still believed in land taxes. And what he did in drawing the original, this is the original supply and demand curve, he said consumers rent, producers rent. Consumers rent, producers rent. In other words, this triangle in here between supply and demand is rent going to consumers and to producers. And now any modern economic text has changed the term to consumer surplus and producer surplus, because modern economists don't believe in rent. Rent's an old-fashioned thing that you got from farmland, but farmland is no longer important, so rent is no longer important, and thus we banish rent from modern economics. But Alfred Marshall knew that there was rent there, and in fact lots of rent. So, page down. Here is Marshall's supply and demand curves again, colored slightly. And again, you have consumers rent, producers rent, and in case you were wondering, consumers rent goes to pay the consumers' landlords, though they may be their own landlords if they own their own houses. Producers rent goes to pay landlords, unless, of course, the producer owns the land, in which case the producer pays the rent. But so basic supply and demand, consumers and producers rent, ultimately goes to land, because land is the fixed factor of production. And now we look at how does a tax affect supply. This is a very simple tax of an amount T on supply. And as you can see, this is your supply curve, same one we saw in the picture above. And it has the effect of raising the supply curve, which means that this quantity here, which originally you could get at this price, now costs more because you've put a tax on it. And that's your basic effect of a tax on supply. And that's your usual supply curve sloping up, as you would expect, because you know the higher the price, the more an ordinary producer is willing to supply. Okay, And, oh boy, all sorts of stuff going on here. Here is that same diagram with a tax. Here is the tax on a supply and demand. So this is the amount of the tax, the pink here. And you can see now that this part here, sort of purple, is the amount of tax paid by consumers. It comes out of rent, because that's consumer rent. Here is the amount of tax paid by the producers. Again, it comes out of rent. And it creates what we call excess burden. That is rent, lost rent, rent that never gets produced because this production here disappears. Because that's what a badly designed tax does. It kills production, it kills wages, it kills jobs. So this is, here is your loss in production due to this tax, which again is shared between producers and consumers. And again, it reduces how much consumers can pay for their houses. And the producers can pay too. Okay. But, miracle, if you have a fixed supply of something, land or spectrum, or you can name patents on something or other, fishing rights, broadcast, all sorts of things are in fixed supply, then guess what? The supply curve, instead of sloping like that, the supply curve goes straight up. That's a fixed supply. So what happens if you put a tax on something in fixed supply altogether in chorus? We all know the answer. Yeah, it all falls on the producer. None of it is passed on, and there is no loss in production. That's the beauty of a land tax or a tax on spectrum or any other fixed natural resource. Okay, and I'm just doing a couple of, just to show what happens when you tax wages. If you tax low-wage workers who tend to be down here, lightly attached to the workforce, they work part-time, they're easily discouraged by transportation costs. So this is a labor supply curve. If you have a wage tax, which we have with our Social Security tax, that is a major, major discouragement of employment. Look at that. A lot of lost jobs. And however, and I know here I am departing with some very good Georgists, an income tax or wage tax affecting very high wage workers, that's the upper brackets of the income tax in the US. I don't know quite what your income tax is here, but if you you get some CEO who's making $250 million a year, and if you're going to tax him a couple of million, do you think he's going to work less? No, he's working very hard because he enjoys his job. It's got lots of perks, or most of them are working very hard. And the point is a tax on high income has very, very little effect on employment. And that was apparent in the 50s and 60s in the United States, which was a real boom time after World War II. Very high marginal rates, and the result was that at companies like Ford Motor, I think the ratio of the CEO's wage to that of the lowest paid worker was maybe 40 to 1, and now it's several hundred to 1. And I'm sure they work just as hard. So anyway, a tax on high wage workers is not that bad. It's really collecting mostly rent. So here are ranked taxes. Obviously the best tax of all, we all know that, I hope all of us here know that, is a land tax. A tax on pure economic rent. Could be a tax on broadcast licenses too. Corporate profit tax, again, also is a pretty good tax. You're essentially taxing rent. The corporate profits are rent. There's a little marginal effect, and well, don't worry about that. Anyway, so there's little marginal effect. The problem with a corporate profit tax is, of course, in these days, corporations can incorporate in the Bahamas or Panama or Ireland or God knows where else and claim to be making no profits in the United States or in Australia. I'm sure you've got guys doing that here too. And that's a problem with if you were actually able to tax corporate profits and they weren't able to hide them overseas, it would be a pretty good tax. Okay, high income tax, again, has little negative incentive. It hits mostly rent. But again, you've got the super rich people who have all of these tax shelters in Panama and the Jersey Islands, the Isle of Man, where my husband's family came from, was the Isle of Man, and that's a great tax shelter place. If you've never heard of the Isle of Man, it's a little island between Ireland and England. And then you get down the building tax, and Georgists go nuts about the building tax. Well, the building tax is bad, but it's not as bad as some other things. You know, and again, you tax the building, and it lowers the rent on the land. Sales, again, if you tax oil and minerals, most of that is passed on to the sheiks of Araby. But now you get down here, low income payroll tax, that is very destructive to the economy. Sales on food and other so-called essentials is very destructive. And then, of course, you have tax subsidies that are built into the tax system that help those particular landowners, and fast write-offs, undertaxing of capital gains, and so forth. I mean, our income taxes in the U.S. were already tremendously biased in favor of landholders and wealthy corporations, and of course the new tax law that just passed was even worse. So, yeah. Next. However, it isn't just taxes that cause these problems. Excess burden from private behavior. Monopolists withhold production to increase their rent, and here's some locals. NBN, I think I got that right, is one of your broadcast companies here, and they have been accused of spectrum squatting, which is they have some spectrum which they haven't been using, and now the question is, are they going to be allowed to bid on upcoming auctions of more spectrum? And monopsonists are single buyers. Well, I think of Kmart, I think of any of these chain burger joints. They have a nice little deal in which they have non-compete clauses for their ordinary workers. What that means is that if you work at Burger King, you can't go and work for McDonald's. And they use this device to suppress the wages of their workers. So that's being a monopsonist. I mean, the classic monopsonist is, of course, the coal company that has the company town and forces the miners to buy in the company store, etc. But there are monopsonists all over the place, and again, they are also causing excess burden, damaging the economy. Cartels as well. Well, there was something about Queensland pre-mixed concrete, but OPEC is global, and OPEC withholds production to drive up the cost of oil and gas, though they're not terribly successful at it these days because the U.S. has become a major producer again. And another source of excess burden, which was noted by George, is if you are a wealthy person or a large corporation, you're liable to sit on a lot of assets and simply not use them. Henry George railed against folks like Leland Stanford's Union Pacific Railroad, which was granted all sorts of land in exchange for building the railroad. Well, some of that land is still sitting there idle, you know, over 100 years later, including some of the land in Berkeley. So wealthy people, they don't just speculate. Sometimes they just hold assets because they can't be bothered to do anything with them. And you know, George was writing in San Francisco when there were boom times and a lot of absentee speculators, but a lot of land withholders are just, you know, they're too rich to bother. Okay, so quick diagram again. This should start to look familiar, but now it's the monopolist that's doing the dirt. Rather than a tax, it's the monopolist that is reducing production to drive up the price, and they gain this from raising the price. Well, they lose a little bit over here, but they have a net gain. So that's excess burden now from a monopolist instead of from a bad tax. Same thing here is a monopolist employer, single buyer of labor, and what they do is, and this is what places like Burger King do, is they hold the wages down. They have a tremendous amount of turnover, but they use this to suppress the wages and also to discourage unionization. So again, monopolists destroy jobs. So these are doing, and again, it's same old excess burden, destroying part of the prosperity of the economy. Cartels do the same thing. I was looking for good examples of cartels, but in the US we have cartels like sun-kissed oranges, which means hundreds of citrus producers have to belong to the cartel. The cartel dictates to them how much they have to produce in order to hold up the price, but of course there's eternally the temptation at those prices to produce more than is allowed. So there's a lot of policing costs, and producers are required to destroy the surplus oranges or the surplus Brussels sprouts or the surplus whatever in order to keep those prices up. And dairy, I don't know, do you have a dairy cartel here in the we have a terrible dairy cartel in the US that all the prices are tied to Wisconsin. So, and here is excess burden from government behavior. Now we have bridges to nowhere, roads to nowhere, military spending. Well, you don't have too much. I'm sure you have some unnecessary military spending. We've got huge amounts. Failure to regulate bad private behavior, which is, to rein in those monopolists. And then there is wasted human potential by failure to provide education, health care, pensions, other services to poor minorities. You're destroying the potential of part of the population if you're not providing those services to them. So that's another not so obvious way that government misconduct creates an excess burden. So I think that wraps it up, and I'm going to leave it up to Gavin to take it from here. I flipped his diagram over. It's time to stop the rise of the rent share. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Polly. I'm not Gavin. I'm here to introduce Gavin. Dr. Gavin Putland came to the study of economics from an engineering background. His PhD is in electrical engineering. But he has been the director of the Land Values Research Group and former Prosper alumni staff member. And his work with the Land Values Research Group has focused on identifying land-based statistics that serve as barometers of the wider economy. And he is a treasured member of the Prosper Brains Trust and the author of the report at hand, which I will allow him to speak to at length. Let me find your what do we call these things? Presentations. PDF. Meanwhile, everybody should welcome Gavin to. I apologise, the trackpad on this computer is very subpar. It's hard to use. Sorry, Gav. That's everything all at once.
Control L, I
If we can
think.
get,
Control L.
if we can get just one, that
No,
would.
no, it didn't work, okay.
Yes?
I can live with that.
I apologise, Gavin.
Does the scroll button work if I?
Well, usually
that?
Control L gets you one page per slide.
Oops.
It
Sorry.
should, anyway.
The problem is that it's not loaded in Adobe Photoshop. I don't know. This is Jessie's computer.
But that in the background would do if I can just scroll it up and down. I
Okay.
can live with that.
Can we live with it?
Yes. Do the scroll keys work?
They sure do.
Okay.
And so does the mouse roll.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Laurie.
Gavin.
And I'll just, yes, that will work. Thank you. My speaking notes are not as revealing as Trump's or Zuckerberg's. They're just memory joggers. So I'll try to position them far enough away for me to see them. The property lobby is not homogeneous. It contains factions with competing priorities. Perhaps most obviously, the property lobby is divided between those whose profits come primarily from building and those whose profits come primarily from increases in values of existing properties. And we sometimes see this come to a head in local politics, where some developer wants to build something tall or high density and is opposed by local residents, or rather owners of local residences who like to characterise themselves as local residents, who don't want any competition with their assets. And it may be the case that the owners of local properties have enough votes to swing the local elections, whereas the developers have more clout at state level, in which case the debate is likely to spill over into a debate between the local government and the state government as to who should have the power to approve what. But if you take out the local level, then as far as I've noticed, we don't so often see this conflict come to the surface. And perhaps it was most apparent when the Labor Party went into the last federal election with a policy on negative gearing, which you would think would be favoured by those who profit mainly from building, because it was explicitly designed to encourage new construction. And yet, as far as I noticed, we didn't see a split between the builders and the riders of the escalator of values of existing properties, perhaps because those who were most powerful in the building space also had interests in land banking, and the smaller builders perhaps didn't have enough clout within the organisations to show through. And so those who hoped, those affordable housing advocates who hoped to divide and conquer the builders and the speculators would have been disappointed. But tonight I'm trying to draw your attention to another likely fault line in the property lobby. That is between short-term property investors and long-term property investors. If you buy a property off the plan, say, with the intention of flipping it for a capital gain, you don't care if the market crashes 6 months later. So you don't care if what is holding up the market at the moment is only temporary. But if you are a young person looking to invest for your retirement 40 years hence, or if you're a institutional investor wanting to look after unit holders' interests 40 years hence, or if you're acting on behalf of a corporation that hopes to be immortal, as all corporations do, then you're looking at the much longer term. And if you're investing in property, you know that you're depending on overall economic growth to support growth in your property values. And your interests lie in policies which increase the rate of economic growth, even if those same policies reduce the share of the economy that goes to you or your particular industry. Because if the economy is growing faster, then given sufficient time, the cumulative effect of that growth will outweigh any given reduction in the fraction of the economy going to you or to your industry. And indeed, it appears to be the case that if you want faster economic growth to increase the rate of growth of your properties, you may have to tolerate a smaller fraction of the economy going to your industry. In the first graph here, of which the top seems to have disappeared, slightly disappeared, I have taken a measure of the rent of land as a fraction of GDP. That is the blue curve, and smoothed both GDP growth and the rent measure, and correlated them with various lags between the two. Now, the point of this difference in lag is to show that it doesn't really matter much whether you move things a few years this way or that way, but the point is that the correlation is distinctly negative. The economy grows faster if a smaller fraction of GDP is accruing to property owners in the form of land values or imputed land rents or estimated land rents. And in the green curve, I've added in capital gains with a similar smoothing period. And again, we have this negative correlation. It seems that the economy grows faster if less of it is accruing to landowners in the form of imputed rents and capital gains. And conversely, up the top, we see that the economy grows faster if more of it is accruing in returns to labour and capital. Now, this is looking at Australian figures, and it's a time series, correlated within the time series. And you might say, well, that's not an awful lot of evidence. It's almost anecdotal. But it can be supported by considering the mechanisms involved. If we want jobs and growth, the employers must be able to pay for business accommodation out of the gross revenue of their business, and the employees must be able to pay for residential accommodation within commuting distance of the premises out of wages that the employers can afford to pay out of the gross revenue of the business. And so these considerations mean it will be easier to create jobs and growth if real estate is cheaper. And furthermore, rather obviously, the more employers and employees have to pay for access to land simply in order to exist, the less capacity they have to invest in future growth, whatever form that investment may take. And while there are some vested interests who might not like to admit that higher rents for real estate will crowd out investment in future growth, I'm sure that the same interest groups wouldn't argue if you were to suggest that investment in future growth can be crowded out by the need to pay tax. And it seems to me that the two arguments are quite analogous. Whether you're losing this money in tax or rent, you're still losing the ability to invest it in future growth. And of course, one could look for further evidence. In the Producer Price Index series, I haven't noticed anything that might serve as a proxy for commercial rents, but in the Consumer Price Index stats, there is a series for residential rents, which one might try to correlate with economic growth. And in the System of National Accounts, there is what is called something like the gross operating surplus of privately owned housing. That is correlated with the rent of residential land, and one could combine that with capital gains of residential land to construct something like a residential component of fraction of GDP going to land, and one could correlate that with growth, and one could look at perhaps similar statistics in other countries. They might be hard to get, and one could look at inter-country comparisons instead of time series comparisons. So one could look for other evidence that would support the mechanism. Why haven't I done that yet? Because while these correlations may be one of the more interesting things to come out of this study, it wasn't what I was originally asked to do. What I was originally asked to do was to update a study published by Terry Dwyer in 2003 on the taxable capacity of Australian land. Now, we've heard Polly explain that taxes on land values, according to both conventional economists and unconventional economists, have the advantage that they produce no deadweight, that is, no tendency to destroy economic output. And so that raises the question, how much revenue can we get out of land value taxes in order to replace other taxes and thereby get rid of the deadweight that they that they cause? So that was what motivated this original study. And by combining it with more recent figures from the ABS, I have brought it up to mid-2017. Now, note the word estimated. You're not going to get exact figures for this purpose. Dr. Dwyer assembled figures partly from published statistics and partly from earlier academic studies, and I have supplemented them with more recent official statistics. And you can get official statistics or academic estimates on tax receipts and on land values and on GDP, and you can construct an estimate of the rental value of land out of the capitalised value, which is the blue band in that graph, and you can make reasonable assumptions about the rate of turnover of land and how long the land is held before it's resold, and get estimates of capital gains as a share of GDP, which is the green band in that graph, and of course you can get the tax statistics. But because these are estimates, detractors will try to score points by questioning the value, questioning the accuracy of the estimates. So let's cut to the chase. Let's suppose that this is grossly wrong. Let us suppose that instead of about 22% of GDP going to, 22% of GDP going to landowners in the form of rents and capital gains, let's suppose that we have, say, only 15%. Suppose it might be only 15%. What then? Well, that would mean that the share of the amount of rent and capital gains going to landowners, instead of being 3 times the welfare budget, might be only twice the welfare budget. And it would mean that what is accruing to landowners, instead of being more than 40 times the expenditure on New Start allowance, which allegedly justifies the biggest speculative invoicing scam in the history of the world, to try to claw it back. Maybe it's only 30 times expenditure on New Start. So if this is wrong, if you question the accuracy of these figures, these figures are so many times bigger than the figures that governments normally lecture us about, that you don't get any bragging rights by arguing about whether they're perhaps not quite as many times as I'm suggesting. It's just different orders of magnitude. But let's quibble about it anyway. Let's look at some of the estimates involved. The rental value of land is actually estimated by supposing that the rental yield is 5% per annum. And the realised capital gains are estimated by supposing that about 6% of the stock of land turns over each year, having been held for an average period of 8 years. Now, of course, those figures actually vary. And assuming that they are constant is open to criticism on the ground that that it's not reflecting the actual rents and capital gains for each year. But it can also be defended on the basis that if you're assuming a typical rate of turnover in the land market rather than the actual variable rate, then you're getting a better idea of what is sustainable in the long term in terms of what you can extract from the capital gains for purposes of revenue. So it cuts both ways. So there's the justification for the smoothing and the simplifying assumptions that we make. And there are further explanations in the report on the other approximations that are involved. And yes, there are some quite heroic approximations involved. But again, these figures here are so vast compared with those that governments normally argue about that one can afford to be quite heroic in the assumptions. One can afford to have considerable margin for error and still be making a valid point. Now, if we could capture some of that rent and capital gain for public revenue, it might seem that the some of these blue and green bands would merge into the red band, and the light blue band in the middle for labour and capital would expand consequently. It's not quite as simple as that, because, as Polly explained, there's this thing called all-devouring rent, whereby any increased capacity to pay for access to land, whether it's through the second income in the family or improvements in gross wages or improvements in public services, is competed away in the price of access to land. And similarly, if you take more revenue out of land rents and capital gains and less revenue directly from labour and capital, that extra capacity of labour and capital will be competed away and expand the value of land again, except to the extent that the tax change improves the competitive position of labour and capital relative to land. And that indeed happens, because if you introduce, say, a broad-based land tax, you make it uneconomic for landholders to hold land vacant for speculative purposes. They have to do something with it in order to earn income to defray the tax. And that puts pressure on the landholders to get tenants or sell the land to someone who will. And similarly, if you're introducing a tax on capital gains on land in order to pay for infrastructure, for example, you are making capital gains less attractive relative to current rent, and therefore by default encouraging landholders to try to realise their gains in the form of rent, seek tenants for that purpose, or sell the land to someone who will. And it is this improved competitive position of labour and capital relative to land, which is what would expand the blue section and confer the benefit, confer the greater capacity to invest in future growth, and hence confer the greater economic growth in the long term. Now, at this point, I should perhaps explain the double meaning of trickle up. There are two meanings.
Excuse me, Gavin, I have to go.
Thank you.
See you.
If the economy is growing faster, then whatever share of the economy is going to landowners is also growing faster. So the benefit is going to trickle up in the class sense to landholders, to landowners. And even if the price of that faster growth is a greater fraction of GDP going to labour and capital to allow a faster rate of investment in future growth, that faster growth means the benefit to labour and capital is going to trickle up to landholders in absolute terms, although not in relative terms. They're getting more in absolute terms, or they're getting a smaller share of the economy. The other meaning of trickle up is this all-devouring red effect. If labour and capital gets an advantage through tax cuts, that advantage is going to be competed away in higher rents and prices of land, except to the extent that the competitive position of labour and capital is improved. So it's that it's that improved competitive position that confers the advantage to labour and capital. So perhaps I should fill in the anecdotes that we can get from this. We see that there was a severe squeeze on the fraction, the light blue bit accruing to labour and capital, just before the recession we had to have. And the most severe squeeze of all was just before the GFC. We see more trouble brewing here, of course. And there is a squeeze of sorts around the time of the Great Depression, but with a difference. It seems that there is some element of land values increasing as a fraction of GDP, not because land values are increasing, but because GDP is decreasing. The timing doesn't look quite right for that to be what triggered the Depression. Another thing that you can see there, of course, is the different policy responses to crashing asset values. Here we see reductions in official interest rates reviving the housing market in recent years. We don't see any similar policy response here. And that, by the way, is one reason why I found it convenient to confine the correlations to the post-war period. You get further, you get complications, differences in policy, you get wartime, it becomes harder to make generalisations, whereas if you look at the post-war period, look at comparatively normal times, you can be more confident about what the correlations are. Concerning the effects of a company tax cut, to get back to the topical issue, a company tax cut would initially be a cut in, ideally, a cut in the tax on the return to capital, but again, that would tend to be competed away in higher land values. If a cut in company tax makes it more attractive for companies to locate in Australia, then obviously that drives up the value of commercial land in Australia. And even without considering the international effects, if a cut in company tax makes it more attractive to establish a company within Australia, that is still going to increase the value of the land on which newly established companies can operate. And even if it makes it more attractive to expand an existing company within Australia, then still there's going to be more interest in access to the land on which business can be done. And so again, there is going to be a tendency for the benefit to be competed away in land values, to be pocketed by landowners, except unless the cut in company tax is accompanied by some other measure that improves the competitive position of labour and capital relative to land. So, for example, if one were to raise the land tax in order to cut company tax, that would have the desired effect. It would prevent the benefit from being competed away. If one were to raise capital gains tax on property in order to cut company tax, then that would make it more attractive for property owners to seek rents rather than capital gains and improve the competitive position of tenants and buyers, and again prevent the benefit from being competed away in higher land values. Even if one were to impose a vacancy tax, not with a view to raising revenue directly, but rather with a view to making the landowners use their land and seek tenants, then again that would improve the competitive position of tenants and stop the benefit from being competed away. But the point being made is that a company tax cut by itself would tend to be pocketed by landowners and not, as everyone keeps pretending, by workers. That might be a good place to stop.
Thank you very much, Gav. Stick around, Gav, because perhaps there's some questions relating to Gavin's research, or perhaps anything that Polly has raised, or perhaps, given there's only a small number of us, stick around for a beer and a wine and some cheese. I'm sorry if you're vegan, there's grapes. And discuss the questions that you have directly with either Gavin or Polly. I've just given too many options now, haven't I?
Any questions for the whole floor?
Oh, I see. Technology. Does anyone have any particular questions for Gav?
I have one small question. Did you consider, it's an interesting correlation between the rent share and GDP growth. Did you consider doing it or repeating it maybe for a smaller time series with state-based figures? Because I understand that ABS will have state land values, and your rent calculation is effectively just a proportion of land values. I don't know how long the state...
The ABS ones will only go back to the late 80s, I think.
Okay.
And off the top of my head, I don't know how easy it would be to get figures like this going back further. Yeah. But yes, it would be an interesting thing to do.
Expand your data set by 8.
Sorry?
It would expand your data set in each given year by 8 if you'd have a
yes.
Data set
Now, the ABS CPI series for residential rents, I think, is divided by state. That might go back further. And certainly there are, I don't know how far back the gross state product figures go, but looking at both of those, we might be able to get back a reasonable length of time. But as I say, this is something that I'm thinking about but not actually doing, because it wasn't part of what I was initially asked to do.
Sounds like a fascinating avenue for further research.
Yes. And of course I do hope that the issue will be taken up. What I actually envisage is that the project will go two ways. I mean, how much revenue you can get out of land will become one issue, and what the correlation is between the land share and economic growth will become another issue, and I would expect them to diverge, and that one just happened to come out of the other here. Yes?
Gavin, one of the things that I think would be very helpful with this thing is to have not only the shares but also the absolutes, because one always wonders, how much have the taxes absolutely increased, price adjusted. And maybe it would be easier to see, because you want to ask the question, suppose the same amount of taxes were collected, but they were collected from land, what do you think would happen? And what I think would happen was you'd get a great expansion of the blue. But it's hard to see, because you can't tell whether the red is increasing because taxes absolutely are increasing, or just because they're increasing as a share.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have the data, I mean, it's trivially easy to do those graphs again absolutely rather than as a share.
Yes, and that might help to illustrate another sort of trickle up. If you are changing your tax system in such a way as to increase the rate of economic growth, then that is going to increase your tax take in absolute terms, even if there's a initial reduction in the share of
Yeah, of course.
GDP going to taxation. So yes, it's a sort of Laffer curve that realises itself over time rather than immediately.
Yeah, I mean, because you see what's happening there is both you have taxes going up and you have the blue stuff going down. And how much of that change is the result of the red and green going up, and how much of it is a result of the blue going down? And you can't tell when they are as shares rather than absolutely price adjusted, of course.
Thank you.
Gavin, other forms of natural resources and minerals, now there's an emerging water market, other forms of rent, you mentioned, monopoly rent. How does that, are you able to show that within the...
That's not included in the green band there. So what you're raising means that what I've shown here is pessimistic in terms of how much revenue you can raise out of resource rents in general. The reason why I've only shown land rents is that that's the only type of rent for which I can get information over that long period, so that we can see how it's varied. As you probably know, the other Carl's Total Resource Rents of Australia looks at other sources of economic rent and how much revenue can be raised from them, but doesn't do this long time series. But it's more revealing about how much revenue you can raise from economic rents in general, even without relying on the effects of tax cuts being shifted into rent. So, further evidence that what I have here is pessimistic in terms of what revenue you can raise.
One of the big points those interested in monetary reform raise is, look, it's all to do with credit. Wherever we are now, the banking system is going to create more credit. So with that in mind, how far do you think the share of labour and capital can be pushed over time as things like 40-year mortgages, interest-only loans continue to grow?
At the moment, we are on a trajectory where we're driving up property values and driving down wages and salaries, which are the income sources out of which we pay rents and service mortgages. So clearly something's got to give. But it is harder to predict when it gives than it has been in previous cycles. Before the GFC, we knew something was going to happen. Well, some of us did. People in this place knew something was going to happen. But after the GFC, policymakers became much more aware that economic crises, financial crises, follow crashes in land markets, and have been much more creative in finding ways to prop up land markets. And I frankly don't know how brazen they're going to be in doing that. I mean, they could start doing things like allowing first home buyers but not repeat buyers to claim mortgage interest on their tax. Yeah. Ooh. And they could start throwing more money at first home buyers, which was quite effective last time they tried it. And they could start allowing more and more sources of savings to be tapped they can be more brazen than they have been about the use of superannuation. So we just don't know how far they're going to go, but what we do know is the further they go, the longer the disaster is going to take to happen, but the worse it's going to be when it does happen. And I'm afraid that's all I can say.
Good answer.
Yes, as a comment, I can see a tension between what appears to be happening, that is Sydney and Melbourne land prices have started to turn down, and the Anderson suggestion that the real crash will come about 2026, and that might be because the government does find new ways, but I can see nothing short of weird government action stopping this apparent downturn. That's, you know, Australians are just so indebted that it's hard to see anything but really strange government activity to keep that bubble inflated. So, very interesting times.
Oh, I have a question. The Banking Royal Commission. So once that's all finished and they change their policies because they realise that things are quite bad there, and their foreign policy is going to change because they realise that they're pumping in new people for speculation and so forth, what do you think is going to happen there?
The Banking Royal Commission, I think, would make the banks less brazen in their behaviour, but not necessarily make governments less brazen in their behaviour. Governments can still, whatever the Royal Commission says to the banks, governments might still try to compensate for it by changing the tax transfer system, and by changing the treatment of housing for owner occupation. And I just don't know how brazen they will be, how far they will go.
Well, I think are we exhausted for questions?
Maybe one more question that is...
There's plenty more.
I just wondered if you wanted to comment about what you saw as the drivers of this big macro picture in the long term, and not so much about the correlation between the rent share and GDP growth, but just on the distributive decomposition of national income. I mean, are there any periods that you identify particular causes? Are we talking about globalisation or labour protections, or just the fact of growing population in a country with only a limited number of cities and a limited amount of land in those cities? I just wondered if you had any comment on explaining the overall change in the breakdown in the distribution of shares.
In productivity terms, we have a serious lack of drivers. We want to dig up our dirt, ship it overseas, borrow against the income and blow it on housing. As David Llewellyn-Smith from Macro Business keeps pointing out. But one can identify particular influences. What have we here? Between in the mid 2000s, one could discern a correlation between. You don't actually see it here. You see it in the rent figures rather than the price figures. Between about 2006 and 2009, you could confidently say that the increase in rents was driven by immigration. It was too obvious. But the prices are a bit out of sync because the prices are determined by what people are silly enough to lend and borrow rather than rational discounting of future rent streams. And by the way, I'm a bit unconventional in that respect. It is said that the rational value of a piece of land is the discounted present value of the future rent stream. But when you have a growing rent stream and you try to work out the discounted present value, you get ridiculously high price to rent ratios, even infinite price to rent ratios, which tell you that the price is going to be determined not by the discounting, but by what people are silly enough to borrow and lend. But the point is, what they are silly enough to borrow and lend is less than, rather than greater than, what you would what you would think from discounting the rent stream. So you can have what I've come to call a sub-intrinsic value bubble. You can have a bubble that has to burst, not because people are paying more than something is worth, but because the financial system can't support what it's worth, or what it is theoretically worth. And that, I contend, is why land buys and sells for what people will lend and borrow. So that's part of the reason why you get this lack of syncretism between prices and rents. But to answer what I think was part of the question, you can see in the blue part, which is proportional to land prices, you can see the reduction in value triggering the near recession. You can see the effect of the first homeowners boost. You can see the effect of its end. You can see the effect of loosening of monetary policy. You can see earlier you can see the effect of the Commonwealth additional grant. Remember, the first homeowners grant was originally introduced supposedly to compensate for the GST. It turned out not to be enough. There was a post-GST slump in activity in the housing market, and in March 2001, I think it was, the Commonwealth additional grant came in, which was a supplement to the first homeowners grant, interestingly for new homes only, done by a Liberal government. And you can see here the recovery in the land price. And we see here where high interest rates began to bite at the end of the 80s, but again, maybe it wasn't just high interest rates, maybe prices were too high anyway. Yes, Brian?
Could the winding back of taxes on property and such as the Whitlam government moving in to pay, initially I think it was about half local government income out of federal taxes because we can't put rates up anymore, and the getting rid of estate duties from the states and the feds, wouldn't those sorts of policies have explained some of the increases since the 70s, particular, and things like negative gearing from the 90s onwards?
Well,
these are positive policies that surely must have helped inflate or give signals to people, well, this is where we've got to go, you know, because
yes.
we're unwinding taxes on. It seemed to be an international fashion when you look at it.
To try to remember those things in roughly reverse sequence. Negative gearing in theory was always there, but what happened in 1999 was the discounting of capital gains,
Yes.
which of course is the rationale. Capital gains, of course, are the rationale for negative gearing. So if capital gains were taxed more lightly, there was more incentive to run up losses, run up current losses in order to make capital gains. And so I think it was the discounted capital gains in 1999 that helped to tick things up through the noughties. Concerning the Whitlam government's effect, this takes us back to
Early 70s?
I did mention it in the report, and I've forgotten the exact years, but I concluded that one could see a very slight spike, it might be here, when the Whitlam government started helping local governments. But because of all the other influences, I wasn't sure that one could draw any conclusions. You see, land prices are going to be influenced by capacity to pay, wherever that capacity may come from. And while a reduction in the taxation of land would be expected to increase land prices, any simultaneous increases in other taxes would be expected to reduce capacity to pay for land and hence depress land prices. And perhaps the clearest example of that was in the mid-80s, when the Hawke-Keating government quarantined negative gearing for a while, introduced the capital gains tax. Both of those things should have reduced land prices, but at the same time, they reduced rates of personal income tax, which of course was the motivation for it. And perhaps those effects cancelled out in terms of capacity to pay for land, and perhaps that's why we don't see much happening here. So,
Alongside the
it's hard to deny the obvious